There was a moment here in Australia, when the wind seemed to whisper more than simply breeze. It whispered through bunkers that were never opened in anger. Through tunnels dug by people who believed, with complete seriousness, that the enemy was coming, and who poured concrete and installed blast doors and stocked ammunition in places that still stand, decades later, waiting for a war that chose a different direction. There is something particular about infrastructure built for catastrophe that does not arrive. It was not built for a purpose that ended. It was built for a purpose that never began. The preparations are intact. The threat dissolved, or moved, or never materialized in the form anticipated. And the places built to meet it are left behind, too solid to demolish, too specific to repurpose, holding the shape of a fear that turned out to be wrong about the details. We are counting down 5 Australian places built for a war that never came. One tunnel system was carved into a cliff above Darwin's harbour to survive a Japanese bombing campaign that did not return. One fortress guarded a harbour entrance that no enemy ship ever approached. One bunker network was built beneath a city to keep a government functioning through a nuclear attack that did not happen. One base was built in the desert to test missiles for a war fought in Europe that ended without a launch. And one set of coastal guns was installed, manned, and ready, and fired, in 50 years of service, at nothing. Like this video if you have ever stood inside something built for a catastrophe and felt the quiet of preparation that was never used. Subscribe because Australia has a shadow history of wars prepared for and never fought. Let's break it down. Number 5. Fort Scratchley, Newcastle, New South Wales. Fort Scratchley sits on a headland above Newcastle Harbour, its coastal guns pointing seaward toward the Pacific. It was built in the 1880s when the fear was Russian naval attack, a fear taken seriously enough to justify excavating a headland, installing heavy artillery, and garrisoning it with soldiers who spent their service watching water on which no enemy appeared. The fort was upgraded through the First and Second World Wars. In June 1942, it became the only Australian mainland fortification to exchange fire with an enemy vessel, a Japanese submarine that surfaced offshore and shelled the city. Fort Scratchley returned fire. The submarine withdrew. The exchange lasted minutes. It is the single moment in the fort's history when its purpose and reality briefly aligned. For the rest of its operational life, from the 1880s to the 1970s, Fort Scratchley's guns pointed at water that contained no enemy. The fear that built it migrated from Russia to Germany to Japan to the Soviet Union, and the fort was maintained and upgraded through each migration, and the enemy it was upgraded to meet never came within range. One historian wrote, "Fort Scratchley is a complete record of Australian coastal anxiety across a century. Every upgrade reflects a different fear. The guns were always ready. The targets never arrived. Picture this. It is a morning above Newcastle Harbour. The Pacific is the blue of a coast watched for enemies for over a century. The guns point seaward. The water they cover has never carried what they were prepared for. The fort is a museum now. The readiness is preserved in the same concrete that was poured when the readiness was genuine." Number 4. Darwin's Tunnel Network, Northern Territory. In 1942, after Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin in the largest foreign attack on Australian soil, the military carved tunnels into the sandstone escarpment above the harbour. They were designed to protect oil storage from further air attack, to ensure Allied fuel supplies could survive a continued bombing campaign. The tunnels were completed, stocked, and ready. The Japanese campaign did not return to Darwin with the intensity anticipated. The war moved. The threat the tunnels were built to survive did not materialize in the form prepared for. What remains is wartime engineering inside a sandstone cliff, the tunnels, the machinery, the evidence of urgency in the construction. You walk through them and feel the weight of the decision to carve storage into living rock because the alternative, leaving fuel exposed to the kind of attack that had already come once, was not acceptable. One visitor wrote, "You feel the fear that built them. Not a vague fear. A specific, reasonable fear, held by people who had just watched their city bombed, that it would happen again and be worse. The tunnels are the shape of that fear made in stone. Picture this. It is a morning in Darwin. The harbour is calm before the heat arrives. The escarpment above contains tunnels carved by people who believed the bombers would return. They did not return as anticipated. The tunnels hold the shape of a preparation that turned out to be more than necessary. Number 3. Larkhill Bunker Complex, Sydney, New South Wales. Beneath the suburbs of Sydney, during the Cold War, the Australian government built hardened facilities designed to allow essential government functions to continue through a nuclear attack. The specific locations and capacities remain only partially declassified. What is known is that significant investment went into the infrastructure of governmental survival, communications, power, command. In anticipation of a war that would require a government to keep functioning after the cities above had been destroyed. The nuclear attack these facilities were built to survive did not come. The Cold War ended without a launch. The bunkers were maintained through decades of tension and stood down through decades of thaw. Some have been decommissioned. Some remain in service. The full extent of what was built beneath Sydney has not been publicly accounted for. The facilities were built by people who took seriously the possibility that Sydney would be targeted, people with access to intelligence assessments who concluded that preparation was rational. The preparation was never tested. One declassified planning document stated, "The function of this facility is to ensure continuity of essential government in conditions where surface operations are not possible." The conditions described were never met. The facility was built anyway. Picture this. It is a morning in Sydney. The city is above ground, functioning, ordinary. Somewhere beneath it, the infrastructure of survival built when bombing seemed genuinely possible still exists in some form. The city it was built to outlast is still here. The war it was built for is not. Number 2. Woomera Rocket Range, South Australia. Woomera was built in 1947 as a joint British and Australian facility for testing rockets and missiles both countries believed would define the next war. It was designed for weapons systems needed if the Cold War turned hot, ballistic missiles, guided weapons, delivery systems for nuclear warheads Britain was developing and Australia was hosting the testing of. The specific war Woomera was built to prepare for, a European conflict escalating to nuclear exchange, with Britain deploying weapons tested in the South Australian desert, did not happen. The British nuclear program evolved in directions that reduced Woomera's relevance to British strategic planning. The rockets were real. The technology was genuine. The war did not come in the form anticipated. Woomera continues to operate. But the original purpose belongs to a world that did not fully materialize. The desert facility built for one war's weapons is still testing weapons, for wars not yet come, in a continuation of preparation that has outlasted every specific threat it was designed to meet. One defense historian wrote, "Woomera is the most expensive preparation in Australian history for a war that did not happen as anticipated." That is not a criticism. It is a description of what deterrence costs and what it looks like when it works. Picture this. It is a morning in the South Australian desert. The rocket range extends across country chosen for its emptiness. The war its weapons were prepared for chose a different shape. The testing continues. The desert does not distinguish between preparations that were vindicated and those that were not. Number 1. Fort Queenscliff, Victoria. Fort Queenscliff guards the entrance to Port Phillip Bay, the body of water that contains Melbourne. Built in the 1880s and maintained until the 1990s, its guns covered the channel any enemy fleet approaching Melbourne would have to pass. For over a century, those guns were ready. No enemy fleet ever approached. The fort is extraordinary in its completeness. The Victorian-era architecture, the gun emplacements, the tunnels connecting positions, the magazines, all intact, preserved by the fact that it was never used in the way it was designed and so was never damaged by that use. Standing in Fort Queenscliff and looking through the gun embrasures at the bay entrance is to understand, physically, the difference between readiness and use. The fort was always ready. The readiness was the point. The guns never fired because the presence of the fort was the deterrent, the preparation being the message, the war being the thing the message was designed to prevent. One former garrison officer said, "We maintained Fort Queenscliff seriously because seriousness was what it required to serve its purpose. The purpose was that no enemy would test whether we were serious. It worked. I am not sure whether that means we succeeded or simply that we were lucky." And in that quiet hush, beneath the whispering gums, inside the bunkers and tunnels and gun emplacements built for catastrophes that chose a different direction, I realized not all shadows hide. Some simply invite us to see. We just counted down 5 Australian places built for a war that never came. The preparations were genuine. The fears were reasonable. The wars were real, fought by real people, in forms that did not reach the places prepared to receive them. What remains is the preparation itself, concrete and steel and carved stone, holding the shape of a readiness that was never tested in the way it was built to be tested. What would you preserve from a war that never happened? Leave it below. If this video showed you something worth seeing, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a different kind of map. We will see you in the next one. This video expresses poetic and reflective storytelling. Historical details are based on publicly available sources. It does not offer military or political analysis.